Peace, peace, peace. We back. This is part 3. Told you I got to do this in 30 minutes. So welcome back to what I call now Rational Lens Podcast, where logic comes into focus, right? That's the monarchy for this podcast. Rational Lens Podcast, where logic comes into focus. And when we left off, we was talking about the black conquerors that were African descent who came and enslaved the indigenous people of the Americas, who also were melanated, dark-skinned people. You understand? These black conquistadors came over here on the behest and the power of the Spaniards, the Spaniard monarchy, which was a Christian monarchy of black royal bloodline that came from Africa, North Africa, which we call the Maghreb or the Maghribi. We also found out that these people also came from Egypt. You understand? From a person that we call Agenor. Agenor was the king of Egypt that moved to Phoenicia, and he had a brother called Balus, who also was the king of Egypt. And we know Egypt was the advanced civilization where the great pyramids were built, and those people were advanced beings that would deal with math and science and engineering and things of that nature, and they created this advanced extraterrestrial culture. You understand? And they also were the bloodline of the gods, because in the mythology, as I decoded it to y'all, they said Agenor had a daughter named Europa, where we get Europe from, or European from, and she fell in love with Zeus. And we know that Zeus was the gods of the gods. He was the most powerful gods of all the gods, right? And they fell in love with each other. And Zeus changed himself into a white bull, the white being symbolized of purity, right? It also can be the symbolize of the Caucasian, right? And the bull symbolizing the astrological sign of Taurus. And these two, the gods and this royal bloodline, Queen Europa, who was the daughter of Agenor, who ruled in Egypt first, and then he moved to Phoenicia, and his brother took over Egypt, who was known as Balus. Balus also was known in the Babylonian as Marduk, and in Egypt he was known as Ra, which is the symbol of the sun. So those people of the sun, which are your non-ether, woolly hair, big nose, high cheekbones, and big lip beings, those are the people of the sun, the non-ether. These are your divine beings, right? And Agenor became king of Phoenicia. So that means that Phoenicia was also dark-skinned people, who was an admiralty seafaring culture, right? And Europa, where they get Europe from, or European from, she mixed in with Zeus, the gods. So you had the royal bloodline and you had the god bloodline from Zeus and the royal bloodline from Europa that came together. And she was also a black queen that came from Europe. Her line come from Europe. Not Europe, but Egypt, which later on planted itself in Europe. This is where you get Europa from, right? And those black conquistadors who came from Europe, which was the black nobility, that means that they also had the god gene and the god blood in them. And they came over here under the behest and power of the Spaniards, who was a Christian monarchy who colonized America, right? And I explained to y'all the different black conquistadors, Juan Valente and Juan Gerardo. You understand? And Christopher Columbus also was a black conquistador, right? But let me finish reading. It says the Spanish colonization of America began in 1493 on the Caribbean islands of Hispaniola, which is known as Haiti and Dominican Republic. After the initial 1492 voyage of the Genoese mariner Christopher Columbus, under the license of Queen Isabella I of Castile, these overseas territories of the Spanish Empire were under the jurisdiction of the Crown of Castile. Under the last territory was lost in 1498, the Spaniards saw the dense population of indigenous people, see, it tells you, of indigenous people as an important economic resource and territory claimed and potentially producing great wealth for individual Spaniards and the crown. The religion played an important role in the Spanish conquest and incorporations of indigenous people, bringing them into the Catholic Church, peacefully or by force. The crown created civil and religious structures to administer the vast territories. You hear that? And Queen Isabella, she was a black queen. Her husband, King Ferdinand, was a black king. So like I said, these black conquistadors that were under the Spaniard Christian royal monarchy that came over here and colonized America and took land and resource from the indigenous people who were your Native Americans, who were your Seminoles, who were your Cherokee, your Choctaw, your Chickasaw. You understand? This was black on black before the assimilation of European, white, Caucasian Europeans. So this is where you have the two United States of America. The original United States of America was set up by the indigenous Aboriginal people, which was called the Iroquois Oral of Peace. And let me bring that up. Give me 1 minute. It's called the Great Law of Peace. So let me decode that. So your Iroquois, who were Native Americans who came from New York, I think you had Iroquois that were in Delaware, Jersey, you understand? They were great law, they deal with a great law of peace, the oral law of peace, and we know that peace means Islam. So that means that these indigenous people were practicing Islam way before the Islamic Empire came over here as black conquistadors and conquered them and took land and resource from them, right? Because the great law of peace was the constitution of the Iroquois. You understand? And I'm going to read that. The great law of peace amongst the Haudenosaunee, which was the Six Nation, comprised the Mohawk, the Onondaga, the Oneida, the Cayuga, the Seneca, and the Tuscarora. These were the 6 nations that came together that made up what we call the Iroquois Nation, right? And the Iroquois Nation had something called the Great Law of Peace, which was their constitution. So the Great Law of Peace, which we know the word peace means Islam. So that means that these indigenous people were practicing Islam way before your black conquistadors that came over here under the power and behest of the Spaniards, right? They were practicing Islam way before they came over here. Because you had your crypto Muslims who converted to Christianity. You understand? And so they didn't bring Islam over here. The culture was already over here. Because the Iroquois and these indigenous people like the Chickasaw, the Seminoles, the Cherokee, your 5 civilized tribes were already dealing in peace with each other and living in peace with each other. Way before your black conquistador, who were your elite Moors, who set up their own form of America, which was a corporate form of America, which was based on admiralty law, dealing with trade and commerce. You understand? And military takeover. These people, indigenous people, deal with peace. So it says, amongst the Haudenosaunee, the 6 nations, the Mohawk, the Onondaga, the Oneida, the Cayuga, the Seneca, and the Tuscarora, the Great Law of Peace, also known as the Gayanasho Goa, is the oral constitution of the Iroquois Confederacy. So they lived as a confederacy, not a federation. A confederacy and a federation is two different things. A confederacy is when a group of people come together, but they still maintain their sovereignty amongst each other. A federation is when you're under one behest, under one power and control. Y'all come together, but that group is under one power and control. You understand? It says the law was represented by symbols on the wampum belt, which function as mnemonic devices for storytellers. Conceived by Dekanawida, known as the Great Peacemaker, and his spokesman, Hiawatha. The original 5-member nation ratified this constitution near modern-day Victor, New York, with the 6 nations, the Tuscarora, being added in 1722. So they already had their own constitution, which was called the Great Law of Peace. They was already dealing with Islam before these black conquistadors that were part of the black European nobility came over here and conquered them and took land and enslaved them and resource. Right? They took resource land and enslaved these people. So they had something called the Great Law of Peace, and that was their constitution. That was the first organic constitution of the United States of America. The organic constitution, which was set up by the indigenous people that were already over here, your 5 civilized tribes, right? Let me say who the 5 civilized tribes are again. Your 5 civilized tribes are your Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, your Muskogee, and your Seminoles. They lived in peace with each other. They had already a constitution. They already established an America that was under the constitution of their Great Law of Peace. And it was the Iroquois Confederation that drafted this constitution, which was a 6-nation, which you had the Onondaga, right? The Oneida, the Cayuga, the Seneca, and you had the Tuscarora, and you had the Mohawk, right? They formed the Confederacy, and they created the original Constitution of America, which was called the Great Law of Peace, Salam, right? In Arabic, it's called Salam Alaikum, right? So they were already practicing Islam before these black conquistadors that came from out of your elite Moors that came from Europe. You understand? Your black nobility who had the divine God blood in them, right? These indigenous people also had divine blood in them. So what I'm trying to get at, that you had 2 United States. You had the United States of America and you had the United States of the Corporation. The United States of the Corporation was created by George Washington, who wasn't the first president, but he was the first president under the Constitution of the United States Corporation. You understand? After they conquered and took over, the original founding fathers, who were your indigenous Native American, your 5 tribes, the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, the Creek, and the Seminole, and the Iroquois Confederation, which was your Mohawk, your Cayuga, Seneca, the Oneida, and the Onondaga, and your Tuscarora. They lived in peace with each other, and they created the first Constitution of America, which was the Great Law of Peace. Right? The Great Law of Peace. Right? So let's go to the book now. Y'all got to get this book. It's called The Black Conquistadors, right? Let me bring this up so I can read page 173 that tells you the name of these black conquistadors, right? Black conquistadors. Let's see if this comes up. I hope it comes up right the way I need it. Yes. So I'm going to read something from this book, Black Conquistadors. This is the page. All right. I'm going to start reading from page 71, 72, and 73, right? It says, the Black Conquistadors, armed Africans in early Spanish America, right? I told you that your Europeans, the black nobility that came from Europe, right, who was under the behest and power of the Spaniard monarchy, who were Christians, they were black Christians, right, Moorish black Christians, and you also had your crypto Jews and your crypto Muslims who were also dark skinned that came from North America. So you had your Spaniards, Christian monarchy, royal family, which was the black nobility, and you had something called the Spanish Inquisition that was getting rid of your Jews and your Muslims in Europe, and they were converting them over to Christianity. And this is where your crypto Jews, your Sephardim Jews, and your Moriscos Muslims converted over to Christianity. They came from North America. They were known as your Moors that controlled Europe for 800 years, bringing Europe out of its darkness. You understand? Then you had the Spanish Inquisition, and they were converting these Jews and these Muslims over into Christianity. And then they were helping these Spaniards of the royal black nobility. These are dark-skinned people, not Caucasians like they taught us in the history books. Later on, Caucasians assimilated themselves with these black conquistadors or the black nobility of Europe and carried out the enslavement, the conquest, just like their black counterparts before them, right? And they came over here, the Spaniards, and they colonized America, and they took land and resource and enslaved your indigenous Native Americans, who were your Choctaw, I'm going to say it again, your Chickasaw, your Cherokee, your Seminoles, right? And also your Iroquois, right? The Iroquois Confederacy, which consists of the Mohawk, the Cayuga, the Onondaga, the Oneida, the Seneca, and the Tuscarora. They formed something which we call the Great Law of Peace, which was your first constitution of the United States that was put together by the original indigenous people of the land. You understand? And it's deep that they called it the Great Law of Peace. That means they was dealing with Islam, living in peace amongst each other way before these black conquistadors came over, causing havoc and mayhem, robbing and stealing, taking land and resource and enslaving them and converting them over to an Anglo-Saxon form of culture and religion, which they call Christianity. These were black conquistadors that were doing this to their own people. Right? I just read to y'all and proved that. Right? So the Black Conquistadors, this is a book, The Black Conquistadors. Right? It's called, and this is page 171. It says the Black Conquistadors, armed Africans in early Spanish America. Juan Garrido, remember, he was one of the Black Conquistadors. I already told y'all. Before I read this, I told you his name, and he was a black conquistador. Juan Garrido, black residents of this city, Mexico. So he took over Mexico. He was a black conquistador that was with the Spaniards your black nobility, Christian monarchs, and they converted these people over into Christianity during the Spanish Inquisition, right? Juan Garrido, a black resident of the city of Mexico, appeared before your mercy and state that I am in need of making a probanza to the propriety of the king. Who's the king? Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand. They were the Christian monarchs, the black nobility, right? A report on how I serve your majesty. He's talking to Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand. He's a black conquistador who conquered Mexico, right? He said, a report on how I serve your majesty in the conquest and the pacification of the New Spain from the time when Marquis de Val Cortez entered it. And in his company, I was presented at all the invasion and conquest and pacification which was carried out always with the said of Marquis, all of which I did at my own expense without being given any salary. So he's talking to Queen Isabella, King Ferdinand, and telling him about the mission that they sent him on to conquer these indigenous people in Mexico. You understand? And he said he did this on his own without even receiving a salary, right? And he was under Marquis del Val Cortez, right? He says also, all of which I did at my own expense without being given either salary or allotment of native or anything else. So he said he did all this under his own expense, not even asking nothing from Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand. No allotments, no money or anything, right? He's a black conquistador that conquered Mexico. And I'm reading from the book, Black Conquistadors. So if you want to, you can get this book, and it tells you about the black conquistadors, those black people that came over here and enslaved the indigenous people. It didn't start off as white people. White people came later and assimilated themselves into the royal black nobility of Europe and carried out the same conquest as their black counterpartners did on their own people. Where it says, all of which I did at my own expense without being given either salary or allotments of natives or anything else. As I am married and resident of this city where I have always lived, and always as I went with Marquis de Val to discover the islands which are in part of the Southern Sea, the Pacific, where there was much hunger and privation, right? And also as I went to discover and pacify the islands of St. Juan de Puerto Rico, and also as I went into the pacification and conquest of the island of Cuba with the delintero Diego Vasquez. In all these ways for 30 years have I served and continue on serving your majesty. For these reasons state above do I petition your mercy, and also because I was first to have the inspiration to sow maize here in New Spain to see if it took. I did in this experiment at my own expense. So he's talking about New Spain. What is New Spain? Right? What is New Spain? For those that don't know, New Spain, we're going to say what New Spain is. Right? It says New Spain, originally the Kingdom of New Spain was the integral territory entity of the Spanish Empire established by the Habsburgs, Spain, it was one of the several domains established by the Spanish conquest of America and had its capital in Mexico. So New Spain was Mexico. And these black conquistadors, right, came over here under the power and behest of the Spanish black monarchs who were Christians to conquer New Mexico. And my man, what was his name? Juan Garrido. And I just read from the book, Black Conquistadors, of him talking about how he came over here to New Spain, which is Mexico. He did it on his own expense. He didn't get no salary or any allotment. You understand? And he came over here and he planted maize, which we call that corn. You understand? So he came over here to big up so that he can get a plantation full of corn going so he can make his money. You understand? He was a black conquistador that conquered Mexico and Cuba. Right? This is in the book, Black Conquistadors. Right? It goes on. So let me come back. What time is it? I'm going to come back and finish reading the book, Black Conquistadors. So I hope y'all stay with me.